The room smells of coffee and stale cigarette smoke. It is a Sunday morning in Honolulu, mild by the standards of the season, and the light angling through the windows of the Fort Shafter Information Center is the color of pale butter. A young Army lieutenant, 28 years old, is seated at a plotting table that is largely empty. He has been on duty since 4 in the morning. This is only his second shift here. The building is quiet. Most of the operators who should have been at their stations plotting incoming aircraft have already gone to breakfast, because at 7 o'clock in the morning, on the 7th of December 1941, the war has not yet arrived, and the mess hall has hot food, and there is no reason not to eat. The telephone rings. The lieutenant picks it up. His name is Kermit A. Tyler. He is a fighter pilot by training, not a radar officer, and the truth is he has not been given any coherent instruction about what to do with the information he might receive over that line. He is here, more or less, because someone was needed at the desk and he was available. On the other end of the receiver is a private stationed at a mobile radar unit at the northern tip of the island, a place called Opana Point, 330 feet above the sea on the ridge of the Kuku Range. The private's name is Joseph Lockhart, and he sounds, by every account that later reached the historical record, both puzzled and insistent. He and another private, George Elliott, have been staring at their oscilloscope since a few minutes past 7. What they are looking at is unlike anything they have seen in training. It is not a smudge, not a flicker. It is a mass. It is, in Lockhart's own later phrasing, the biggest blip either of them has ever observed on the screen. The scale of the return, translated into practical terms, is this. An incoming formation of aircraft, 136 miles north of the island of Oahu, bearing down on the coast at roughly 180 miles per hour. What Lockhart cannot know, what the equipment cannot tell him, is that the shape on his oscilloscope is composed of 183 separate airframes, 6 fighter squadrons of Mitsubishi Zeros to sweep the sky clear, level bombers carrying converted battleship shells modified into armor-piercing weapons, torpedo planes with specially finned torpedoes designed to run true in the shallow waters of the harbour, dive bombers loaded for the aircraft on the ground. It is the largest naval airstrike ever launched in the history of the world to that moment, and it is 45 minutes from its target. Tyler listens. Tyler thinks. Tyler has been told, informally, in the manner of a piece of hallway gossip more than a briefing, that a flight of Army B-17 heavy bombers is due in from the mainland that morning, ferrying across from California, and that they are expected to approach from a bearing not entirely unlike the one Lockhart is describing. He also knows that a Honolulu radio station has been broadcasting Hawaiian music through the night, a common navigational aid for the ferry flights, keeping their radio direction finders pointed at the islands. The two facts, in his head, converge into a picture that is comfortable and familiar. Bombers, American bombers, nothing to be concerned about. He says the words that will define the rest of his life. Well, don't worry about it. The exchange, from the ring of the telephone to the click of the receiver returning to its cradle, lasts less than a minute. Lockhart and Elliott at Opana Point watch the blip continue to close. They will keep tracking it, informally, for another 20 minutes or so, until the formation crosses inside the mountain shadow at around 20 miles out and vanishes from their scope. By then they have driven back to breakfast in the truck. The war is over the horizon and coming fast, and the men who have seen it coming have been told politely that it is nothing to worry about. That is the sentence on which the entire subsequent architecture of the American security state will eventually be built. That is the failure. Not the courage of the sailors, not the training of the pilots, not the shells in the magazines. A phone call, a guess, a dismissal that took less time to deliver than it takes to soft-boil an egg. Because the truth of Pearl Harbor, examined without sentimentality, is that the warning existed. The warning was received. The warning was on the line at 7:15 in the morning, spoken aloud, in English, by an American soldier to an American officer, 40 minutes before the first bomb fell. The Japanese did not achieve surprise because their approach was invisible. They achieved surprise because the eyes that saw them coming were not connected to the mouths that could give an order, and the mouths that could give an order were not connected to the hands that could pick up a gun. The distance between signal and action, on that Sunday morning, was measured not in miles or minutes, but in institutional gaps. The space between the Army and the Navy, between the radar operator and the fleet commander, between a green lieutenant on his second shift and the collective muscle memory of a nation that had not yet learned to trust its own machines. to understand why the attack of December 7th succeeded, and to understand later why the same attack, transplanted across 8 decades of technological and institutional change, could almost certainly not succeed today. One has to sit with the fullness of that 90-second phone call. One has to feel the ordinariness of it, because the ordinariness is the point. Rewind then, from Tyler's telephone. Rewind 35 minutes. At 6:40 in the morning, in the pale grey light before sunrise, a small 4-stack destroyer is patrolling the entrance to Pearl Harbor. Her name is the USS Ward. She's an old ship, a First World War-era Wickes-class destroyer recommissioned for the emergency, and now given the unglamorous but essential duty of guarding the harbour mouth against submarines. Her commanding officer is Lieutenant William Woodward Outerbridge, and this is his first day in command of any vessel of any kind. He took the ship over less than 48 hours earlier. He has not slept much. Something has already happened that has stripped away any comfortable interpretation of the morning. A minesweeper, the USS Condor, has reported sighting what looked like a periscope in restricted waters, and Ward has been searching the area for over an hour. Then, in the one half-light, a lookout sees something. A dark shape breaking the surface, following in the wake of the target ship USS Antares as she moves toward the harbour gate. It is a conning tower, low and narrow. It belongs to what will later be identified as a Kohyoteki-class midget submarine, one of 5 two-man craft launched from larger fleet submarines the night before, tasked with slipping through the anti-torpedo nets and picking off ships from inside the harbour when the air attack began. Outerbridge acts, and he acts fast. He does not hesitate, he does not wait for further identification, he does not signal for permission. He orders general quarters, he orders the forward gun crew to fire, the number 1 gun misses, the number 3 gun, fired at close range as the Ward closes to a distance of fewer than 100 yards, does not. The shell strikes the base of the conning tower, the submarine begins to founder, Ward passes over the stricken craft and rolls a pattern of depth charges. The water lifts and boils. When the ocean settles, the submarine is gone. It is 6:45 in the morning. The Ward has just fired the first American shots of the Pacific War, more than an hour before the Japanese air fleet arrives. Outerbridge, without wasting a second, goes to his radio room and drafts a message to the 14th Naval District. He has attacked, depth-charged, and sunk a submarine operating in the defensive sea area. He sends it in the clear, then, worried that the phrasing was too clinical, sends a second, sharper message a few minutes later, stating explicitly that he has fired on a submarine. The messages leave the Ward and enter the Navy's communications architecture on Oahu, and there they enter a labyrinth. The report is received at the 14th Naval District headquarters. It is passed along, evaluated, questioned. There have been false submarine reports before. In the anxious weeks of that autumn there had been many, and the natural instinct of any staff officer receiving a Sunday morning contact report is not to sound the general alarm but to seek confirmation. Was it a real submarine? A whale? A buoy? A drifting log? The staff duty officer waits for further information. Admiral Claude Bloch, the district commander, is informed. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, is telephoned at his quarters. Kimmel, according to the account he later gave, says he will come down to headquarters and see what develops. He does not yet order the fleet to general quarters. He does not yet call the army. Because that is the crux. The Navy has the submarine report. The Navy is chewing on it, cautiously, in the way that a bureaucracy chews on any surprising piece of information on a quiet Sunday morning. But the Army, which runs the anti-aircraft batteries, which mans the radar stations at Apana and elsewhere around the island, which is responsible for the air defence of the base. The Army does not know. The Army will not know. The Ward's contact will not travel across the wall that separates the two services in time to matter. When the Army radar operators at Apana Point pick up their gigantic blip 22 minutes later, they will do so in complete ignorance of the fact that a live shooting engagement has already occurred at the harbour entrance. When Lieutenant Tyler picks up his telephone at 7:15, no one has told him that a Japanese submarine was killed within sight of the channel less than an hour earlier. If he had known, if the two facts had lain side by side on his desk, a confirmed hostile submarine, then an unidentified mass of aircraft approaching from the north, even the greenest officer on his second shift would have understood. But he did not know, because nobody had told him. Because there was no mechanism, no protocol, no wire, and no habit by which such a thing was told. The joint congressional investigation that would sit after the war spent nearly a year picking through the wreckage of that Sunday morning's decision-making, and its conclusions were not vague. The single phrase that resurfaced again and again in the report, the phrase that would eventually become a kind of grim epitaph for the pre-war American defense establishment, was this: the liaison between the Army and Navy at Pearl Harbor had been, in the committee's words, completely ineffective. Not inadequate. Not strained. Completely ineffective. Two services, sharing an island, sharing an enemy, sharing a harbour, and unable to place a piece of information on the same table in the same hour when it mattered. This is the deep structure of the disaster. The men in the individual seats, Outerbridge on the ward, Lockard and Elliott at Apana, Tyler at Fort Shafter, did, in their separate ways, roughly what the system was set up to allow them to do. Outerbridge saw an enemy and sank it. Lockard saw a signal and reported it. Tyler received a report and, given what he knew and did not know, offered his best guess. The catastrophe was not made in any one of those seats. It was made in the spaces between the seats. It was made by the walls of an institutional architecture that had been designed for a 19th century war and was being asked to fight a 20th century one. Lieutenant Tyler would carry the phone call for the rest of his days. He would be investigated. He would be questioned. He would be, in the fullness of time, formally exonerated. The boards of inquiry concluding sensibly that a junior officer on his second shift with no adequate briefing, no functioning liaison between services, and only the barest working familiarity with a radar system that had itself only been installed a few weeks earlier, could not reasonably be blamed for failing, in under a minute on the telephone, to correctly identify the opening move of a world war. The failure was not his. The failure was the failure of the system he was sitting inside. He would live a long life, fly again in the war that followed, retire eventually as a lieutenant colonel, and give occasional interviews in which he insisted, always with the same weary composure, that he had made the best judgment he could with what he had. The historical consensus has come, over the decades, to agree with him. But agreeing with him does not close the wound. It only names it. The wound is the gap. The wound is the 90 seconds between a fact and a decision, in which an entire fleet was lost because nobody in the room had the authority, the knowledge, or the picture to say the words that ought to have been said. To understand how that gap could exist, how, on a fortified American naval base on an American island, in an increasingly obviously war-shadowed autumn, 183 Japanese aircraft could arrive over the deck of the battleship Arizona without a single warning being properly consolidated. One has to go back further still. Back before Tyler's phone call, back before Outerbridge's depth charges, back to a bay in the northern Kurile Islands on a cold morning 11 days earlier, where the mechanism of surprise was set in motion. The bay is called Hitokapu. It lies on the eastern shore of the island of Etorofu, in a chain of volcanic rocks that trails northeast from Hokkaido toward the Kamchatka Peninsula, a place chosen more than anything for what it is not. It is not on any commercial shipping route. It is not overflown by civil aviation. It is not photographed by tourists or fished by foreign trawlers. It is fog-bound for much of the year, rimmed by pine and basalt, and in November it is already ferociously cold. Under the low grey sky of the 26th of November 1941, a fleet gathers at anchor there that has no business being where it is. 6 aircraft carriers, the fleet flagship Akagi, and with her Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku and Zuikaku, the largest concentration of naval air power ever assembled to that day. Around them, an escort, 2 fast battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, capable of running with the carriers at their 30-knot cruising speed, 3 heavy cruisers, a screen of destroyers, a flotilla of fleet oilers to keep the whole assemblage fueled across the enormous distance it is about to attempt to cross, and prowling ahead beneath the surface, a picket line of submarines, all told, roughly 30 ships, the Kido Butai, the Mobile Strike Force. Command falls to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a cautious officer given, in the great historical irony, the boldest operation of the war. They sail at first light. What they attempt is, by the standards of the age, close to reckless. They have chosen to cross more than 3,700 miles of the North Pacific, a route so far north that the seas are winter heavy. The air is a hard, cold slap on the flight deck, and refueling at sea from the oilers becomes an ordeal of hoses whipping in freezing spray. They have chosen this route precisely because no one goes this way. The commercial trans-Pacific shipping lanes run far to the south, threading between Yokohama and San Francisco through the friendlier middle latitudes. American long-range patrol aircraft, PBY Catalinas flying from Midway or from Oahu itself, sweep sectors of the ocean radiating out from their bases, but their range and their available numbers cannot cover more than fractions of the whole. There are enormous silent boxes of water in the North Pacific that no one is watching, that no one has any reasonable means of watching, and Japanese naval planners have identified those boxes and drawn a line straight through them. They enforce throughout the crossing a discipline that verges on the monastic. No radio transmissions, not a word out of any transmitter. Signal lamps, flag hoists, mouth-to-mouth by megaphone. The fleet talks to itself in the oldest of maritime languages, because any modern chatter across the ether can be picked up, direction found, and traced. Every radio on every ship is either silenced entirely or, in some accounts, physically disabled to remove the temptation of an emergency transmission. When the fleet takes on fuel from its oilers, it does so in seas that make the operation genuinely dangerous, hoses parting under the roll, sailors swept off decks, and the whole choreography carried out under the assumption that even a distress signal from a man overboard could give the mission away and get thousands more killed a week later. The commanders have decided that the crossing itself is worth the price of any single life it costs, and it works. That is the astonishing thing. For 11 days, 30 warships steam across the open Pacific and no one sees them. No merchant vessel stumbles into their track. No patrol aircraft passes overhead on a routine sweep. No coast watcher. No listening station. No signals intelligence intercept catches so much as an errant carrier keying its transmitter. When the fleet turns south, at a point roughly north of Oahu, and begins the final run in toward the launch point some 230 nautical miles from the target, it is invisible to American command not because it is hiding cleverly, but because there is, quite simply, no persistent architecture in the world of 1941 that could see it. There are no satellites. There is no over-the-horizon radar. There is no linked global picture. There is only what a man in a cockpit or a lookout with binoculars can see on a given morning, with the ocean the size that it is. This is the mechanism of surprise, not deception, not primarily, not treachery, geography, and technology. In the world of 1941, a fleet on the open Pacific was, if it kept its mouth shut and stayed clear of the shipping lanes, effectively a ghost. It could sail for weeks under no eye but its own. The Japanese did not conjure invisibility. They exploited a blindness that was already there. And when, in the pre-dawn dark of the 7th of December, Nagumo turned his carriers into the wind, and the first aircraft rolled down the flight deck of the Akagi, with a rising sun painted on its fuselage, the American command on Oahu did not know that a Japanese fleet existed within 1,000 miles of them. The Ward would soon put a shell through a midget submarine. Apana Point would soon paint the largest blip its operators had ever seen. Kermit Tyler would soon pick up his phone. But at the moment of launch, at roughly 6 in the morning local Hawaii time, 183 Japanese aircraft were airborne and inbound, and the great American base beneath their line of flight was breathing softly in its Sunday sleep, unaware. This is the fact that has to sit at the centre of the room before anything else can be understood. In 1941, the surprise of Pearl Harbor was not, at its root, a failure of vigilance. It was a failure of vision, the physical, geographical, technological inability of a nation to see across the ocean that separated it from its enemy. And the further failure that turned surprise into catastrophe was a failure of connection. The walls between services, the silences between radios, the 90 seconds on a telephone in which a warning that had actually been received died in the ear of an officer who had not been given the picture that would have let him understand it. Everything that follows in the modern half of this story, the satellites, the launch detection networks, the missile interceptors, the layered picture of a persistent, continuously updated intelligence architecture, grew, whether directly or by long inheritance, out of those two failures. The blindness would be answered by seeing everything, all the time, from orbit. The silence between services would be answered by an entire institutional rewiring, a National Security Act, a unified Department of Defense, a chain of joint commands, a doctrine of shared intelligence that would take decades to build and remains imperfect but exists now in a way it did not on the 7th of December 1941. The whole shape of the modern American security state is legible as an answer to a phone call that lasted less than a minute in a room at Fort Shafter. But before that shape can be traced, before the thought experiment can be conducted honestly, one more scene has to be walked through. Because the crossing was silent, and the warning was missed, and the fleet arrived, and what came next, at 7:55 in the morning, was the reason all of it is still remembered. The wind is still coming off the Pacific. The palms along the base are moving lightly. Below the Kido Butai's incoming flight paths, at the northern approaches to the island, the terrain rises in dark green ridges into cloud. Ahead of them, past the ridgelines, past the pineapple fields, past the little towns of Wahiawa and Aiea, the harbour lies open like a hand. Battleship Row along the southeastern face of Ford Island, the seaplane ramps, the dry docks, the airfields, Hickam, Wheeler, Iwa, Kaneohe, with their aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, drawn up tight against sabotage rather than dispersed against air attack, because sabotage is the threat that has been briefed and air attack is not. Rows of P-40s, rows of B-17s, rows of Catalinas on the water, the whole American Pacific presence laid out neatly, in daylight, in geometric lines, with the fuel in their tanks and no ammunition in most of the ready lockers, because it is Sunday morning and the war is somewhere else. Kermit Tyler has hung up his telephone. The ward's message is still working its way through Navy channels, being questioned, being weighed. Admiral Kimmel is dressing to come down to headquarters. Private Lockhart is watching his blip close the distance. In the harbour, the band aboard the USS Nevada is preparing to play morning colours at 8 o'clock. Sailors are moving toward mess. The Arizona's boilers are on standby. The California is in the middle of a scheduled inspection with several of her watertight compartments open below the waterline. The Oklahoma has her portside torpedo blisters exposed. Every one of the great grey ships along Ford Island is at what the Navy calls Condition 3, a peacetime readiness posture, with anti-aircraft ammunition largely stowed away in magazines and only skeleton gun crews at their stations. And overhead, unheard, unseen except by 2 men at a radar station who have been told not to worry, 183 aircraft are dropping down to their attack altitudes. The lead flight commander, in the moments before the first bomb falls, will send a signal back to the fleet, a code phrase confirming that surprise has been achieved. The words will pass into naval legend. Tora, Tora, Tora. The clock in the Fort Shafter Information Center ticks towards 7:55. The bright Sunday sun is climbing over the ridge behind Pearl. In less than 3 minutes, the first torpedo will slam into the port side of a battleship, and the 90-second phone call that could have changed everything will pass forever into the country of what might have been. The set on the ridge is unglamorous. It looks, at a distance, like scaffolding a farmer might rig for a windmill, a squat truck, a trailer, a lattice antenna mast turned toward the sea, guyed against the trade winds. Around it the vegetation is low and scrubby, red volcanic dirt underfoot, the northern horizon nothing but water fading into a soft haze. This is Opana Point, at the northernmost tip of Oahu, the place where the island's land ends and the long empty run to the Aleutians begins. The Army calls the equipment an SCR-270, a mobile air search radar of a design so new that its operators are, in a real sense, still learning what its screen is trying to tell them. It is one of 6 such sets recently deployed around Oahu, part of an aircraft warning service that exists, on paper, as a modern layered air defence, and exists in fact as a collection of unfinished pieces waiting to be linked into a working whole. The set has a schedule, and the schedule tells the story of how new it all is. It runs from 4 in the morning until 7, 3 hours a day. Not because the machine tires, not because the antenna needs to cool, not because the enemy is expected only in the pre-dawn watch, but because there are not enough trained men to run it around the clock, and the training pipeline has not caught up with the deployment. After 7, the operators are meant to shut down, secure the truck and go to breakfast. On any other Sunday morning that is exactly what would happen. The screen would go dark, the set would sit quietly in the trade wind. And when the flight of aircraft came down out of the north, no eye and no instrument on the island would see them coming. But this morning, the truck that is supposed to bring Privates Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott their breakfast is late. Elliott, the younger of the two, is still learning to read the oscilloscope. Lockhart, more experienced, has agreed to leave the set powered up and give him extra practice. It is that small act, The decision of 2 enlisted men to spend a little extra time on the equipment because breakfast has not arrived. That puts a working radar into the path of the Kido Butai's first wave. Not doctrine, not readiness, a late truck and a willingness to practice. At 7:02, the return appears. It is not a subtle contact. It is not the faint whisper an experienced hand would have to coax out of the noise. It is, in Lockard's later words, the biggest thing either of them has ever seen on the scope. A return so large that Lockard's first thought is that the set itself is malfunctioning. He checks the equipment. The equipment is fine, the contact is real, and it is closing on the island at nearly 200 miles an hour from a bearing of 3 degrees east of north. There is a plotting procedure of a sort. The men are supposed to report significant contacts to the information centre at Fort Shafter, where a group of officers and enlisted plotters are meant to fuse radar data with reports from the Navy's patrol aircraft, from the ship pickets, from the observer network across the island, and produce a coherent picture of what is in the air over Hawaii. That centre too is new. Its plotters are not yet fully trained. The liaison officers from the Navy, from the Marine Corps, from the pursuit squadrons, are not yet installed at their stations. On a weekday between 4 and 7 in the morning, the room hums with practice. On a Sunday at 7:15, the room is nearly empty. The switchboard operator is there. A pursuit officer, Kermit Tyler, is there for his second shift ever in a job he has not been formally taught to do. That is the human infrastructure standing between a radar contact of 183 inbound aircraft and the sailors sleeping in their bunks along Battleship Row. The equipment worked. That is the sentence to sit with. The SCR-270 at Apana performed exactly as its designers intended. It saw the enemy at a range that would have given the American commanders, had the report reached them, had they credited it, had the fighters been fueled and armed and warned, nearly 45 minutes to get aircraft into the air. 45 minutes is an eternity in air defence. It is enough time to scramble every P-40 on Wheeler Field, to alert every gun crew in the harbour, to bring the fleet to general quarters, to close watertight doors on the California, to man the anti-aircraft batteries on the Nevada, to warn Kaneohe and Iwa and Hickam, to put the entire American Pacific presence into a defensive posture that would still not have won the morning but would have made the morning a battle rather than a slaughter. The machine gave the country 45 minutes. The institutional scaffolding around the machine gave the country nothing. There is no procedure at Fort Shafter for what to do with an unexpected contact of that size, because no one at Fort Shafter has yet imagined it. The imagination has been consumed elsewhere, by submarines, by fifth columnists, by the possibility of sabotage among the large Japanese-American population of Hawaii, and the airspace to the north has been ceded, in the working mental model of the command, to the Pacific itself. There is no doctrine that says, if a returns of unusual magnitude appears at extreme range, do this. There is no red line telephone directly connecting the radar operator to a duty officer who has been trained to escalate. There is a switchboard and a lieutenant answering a phone and a young man's judgment. That judgment on this morning is that the blip is a flight of American B-17s expected in from California. The B-17s are in fact coming. They are in fact at that moment approaching from a bearing not so far removed. Tyler has been told informally, in a conversation with a bomber pilot friend, that the ferry flights sometimes navigate by tuning in to a Honolulu commercial radio station, whose all-night broadcasts of Hawaiian music serve as a homing beacon. On the morning of December 7th, the station is broadcasting through the night. Tyler infers, reasonably by the logic available to him, and catastrophically by the logic available in hindsight, that the music means the bombers are coming, that the blip is those bombers, that the safest advice he can give the young private on the other end of the line is the advice that will not embarrass either of them. Well, don't worry about it. The call lasts less than a minute. Elliot and Lockard, disciplined, keep tracking. They follow the formation south for another 20 minutes, watching the range close, watching the bearing hold steady, watching a mass of unknown aircraft drive directly at the island. At about 20 miles out, the returns dissolve into the ground clutter of the northern ridges, and the men lose them into the mountains. They log their observations, they wait for their breakfast. In another few minutes they will hear the sound of the answer to the question they had been trying to ask. Every warning had worked. That is the thing the historian is required to say clearly. The submarine was seen, the ward fired, the report was made, the radar detected, the privates called. The message reached the information center. Every human being with a role to play in the warning chain, from Outerbridge on the bridge of a destroyer to Elliot bent over the oscilloscope, executed his part of the job. The failure was not at any single node. The failure was in the wiring between the nodes, the doctrine, the liaison, the assumption, the trained instinct about which report to elevate and which to set aside. The failure was that the United States military had, in the years before the war, built the pieces of a modern warning system and had not yet built the connective tissue between them. The pieces were awake. The system was asleep. This is the pattern the post-war investigators will trace and retrace, in hearing after hearing, from the Roberts Commission, in the winter of 1941 through the Army and Navy boards of 1944, to the Joint Congressional Committee that convenes in the fall of 1945. They will read the transcripts, they will interview the operators, they will study the message logs of the 14th Naval District and the duty rosters of Fort Shafter, and they will arrive at a phrase that becomes, in the language of American defense reform, load-bearing, completely ineffective liaison between the Army and Navy. Not incompetent officers, not treasonous negligence, ineffective liaison. A structural indictment of a warning architecture that had grown up in two separate services, on two separate command chains, with two separate cultures, two separate radios, two separate maps, and no reliable habit of speaking to each other in time. That phrase will do a great deal of work. It will feed directly into the legislation that produces, in 1947, the National Security Act, the statute that creates the Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, the post-war United States Air Force as an independent service, and the beginnings of the joint command structure that governs American military operations to this day. Almost every major institutional artifact of the modern American security state can be traced back through the paper trail to the finding that on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, the Army and the Navy had not been able to hand a warning across the fence between them in time to save 2,400 lives, but that reckoning is years away. On this morning, the fence is still there. The ward's message is still being questioned. The Opana blip has been dismissed. The clock reaches 7:55, and out of the sky over Ford Island, out of a bright Hawaiian Sunday morning, with the trade wind blowing and the awnings up on the battleships, and the band on the Nevada readying its instruments for colours, the first Japanese torpedo bombers come in low over the water. The first torpedo strikes the port side of the USS Oklahoma at almost the exact moment that a bugler on another ship raises his instrument to sound the morning call. The concussion is felt across the harbour as a physical thing, a slap in the chest, a hard thump through the soles of shoes on steel decks. Then the second torpedo, then the third, then, in an unravelling that will take barely 20 minutes to complete, the Oklahoma's great grey mass begins to roll, ponderous and unstoppable, portside down into the mud, her mast describing a slow arc across the sky, her superstructure driving toward the harbour bottom, her keel rising out of the water like the back of a whale. Below her armoured decks, hundreds of sailors are trapped in compartments that have suddenly become inverted rooms filled with rising water and dying air. Some will be rescued in the days that follow, cut from the hull by acetylene torches. Most will not. Behind her, along Battleship Row, the same instrument of destruction is being applied to the West Virginia, the California, the Nevada, the Tennessee, the Maryland, the Pennsylvania in her dry dock. Torpedo bombers coming in from the harbour entrance, dive bombers coming down from the sun, level bombers releasing from altitude in patterns that stitch the moored line of ships, and then, at 8:06, or perhaps 8:08, the second exactness is contested even now, a single armour-piercing bomb, dropped from a level bomber at high altitude, punches through the forward decks of the USS Arizona and detonates in or near her forward magazine, where the powder for her 14-inch guns is stored in bulk. The explosion lifts the front third of the battleship out of the water. Witnesses on nearby ships describe her rising bodily, as if a hand had reached under her and pushed. Her forward turrets, weighing hundreds of tons apiece, are thrown upward and settle back at broken angles. A fireball climbs above the harbour to a height that will be visible from Honolulu. In a single instant, more than 1,000 men aboard the Arizona are killed, the largest single-moment loss of American military life in a single event up to that day, and one that will not be exceeded by any single incident of the Pacific War that follows. The men who survived the initial blast, most of them working in engineering spaces aft, will spend the rest of the morning fighting fires on a hull that has effectively ceased to be a ship. The Arizona will burn for 2 more days. Her wreck will settle upright on the harbour bottom, exactly where she was moored, and she will never be raised. She is there still. Oil still rises from her hull in slow, patient drops, one every few seconds, breaking on the surface in iridescent rings. At the airfields, the destruction is different in character, but the same in intent. At Wheeler Field, the P-40s parked wingtip to wingtip against sabotage present themselves to the Japanese strafing runs as a single continuous target and are burned in rows. At Hickam Field, the B-17s that were meant to have been on the airfields of Luzon by December 15th are cut apart on the tarmac. At Iwa, at Kaneohe, at Ford Island, where the Catalina flying boats sit on their ramps and along the seaplane moorings, the same treatment is applied to naval patrol aviation. The aircraft that might have flown out over the northern approaches on the 8th of December to search for the Kido Butai are, by the end of the second wave, in most cases no longer aircraft. 328 American planes are destroyed or damaged before the last Japanese formation turns north for its return to the carriers. The 2 waves take just under 2 hours to complete their work. When the last aircraft breaks off, at around 10 in the morning, the harbour is a landscape that no one who saw it forgets. The Oklahoma has capsized. The Arizona is burning down to her main deck. The West Virginia is sunk in her berth, her upper decks awash. The California is settling. The Nevada, having attempted to get underway and make for the harbour entrance, has been driven aground on the western side of the channel to prevent her being sunk in a position that would block the fleet. The dry dock containing the Pennsylvania and 2 destroyers has been bombed. 19 American ships have been sunk or damaged, some beyond eventual recovery. 2,403 Americans are dead. Sailors and Marines and soldiers and civilians, men and women, aviators and mess cooks and bandsmen and machinists' mates and yard workers who happened to be walking near the docks. Another 1,000 and change are wounded. Beneath the harbour's oil-slicked surface, hundreds of bodies are still inside the ships and will remain so for weeks, months, in some cases forever. These are the numbers that must be held for a moment before the thought experiment can begin. They are the number of empty chairs at Christmas dinner 3 weeks later in Nebraska and Ohio and Georgia and every other state of the Union. They are the letters that begin to arrive in the mail across December and January. The standard opening phrase, "The Secretary of the Navy regrets to inform you," repeated 2,000 times in slightly different variations by clerks working double shifts. They are the young widows. They are the children who will grow up remembering their fathers as photographs on the mantel. They are the older men who never got to be old. The Arizona alone accounts for nearly half of the total dead, and the Arizona's dead skew young, enlisted sailors in their late teens and early 20s, in the numerical prime of their lives, in the compartments where the powder was. The country's memory of the attack, in the 8 decades since, has done a specific kind of work with these numbers. It has made them mean something the men who died could not, in the moment of dying, have known they would mean. Their deaths become the reason the United States enters the war. Their deaths become the reason Congress votes, the following day, with one dissenting voice, for the declaration that will send 400,000 more Americans to their own deaths across the Pacific and the Atlantic before it is finished. Their deaths become the reason the atomic bomb is built and used. Their deaths become the reason for the post-war order, for the Marshall Plan, for NATO, for a permanent American military footprint in the Western Pacific that has now lasted longer than most of the countries it was designed to protect have existed as democracies. Whatever else the 7th of December is, it is the hinge on which the American 20th century turns, and it is that scale of consequence, the size of what these 2,400 deaths produced, that requires the next part of this documentary to be undertaken with a certain kind of care. Because the question that follows, the question the film is here to explore, is the question of what would happen if the same attack were attempted today. And there is a way of asking that question that would cheapen the answer. There is a way of asking it that would sound as though the answer were meant to make the men on the Arizona seem naive, or the Army and Navy of 1941 seem stupid, or the whole vast tragedy seem like something that could have been avoided by better software. That is not the argument. The argument is smaller and in its way more respectful than that. The argument is that the very specific structural conditions that made surprise possible in 1941, the blindness in the Northern Pacific, the silence between the services, the absence of a doctrine for the new equipment, the assumption that the ocean itself was a wall, have been answered deliberately over 80 years by machines and by institutions that exist because of what happened on this morning. The country looked at its own dead, and it built the thing it wished had been in place. The thought experiment is a way of asking how well the answer worked, so the pivot must be made cleanly, and it must be made honestly. What follows is not a prediction. It is not a claim about a future conflict or a comment on any current adversary. It is a structured counterfactual, a specific and bounded exercise. Take the actual Japanese Combined Fleet Strike Force of November and December 1941. The 6 carriers, the 2 battleships, the accompanying destroyers and cruisers and tankers, the same 353 aircraft, the same North Pacific route, the same doctrine of radio silence, the same intent, and place them in the ocean of today. Not against the American Pacific Fleet of today, in a fair fight adjustment of both sides. That is a different question, and a much harder one. Only the American surveillance and defensive architecture is transplanted forward. The attackers keep their 1941 tools. What would happen? Where and when would the attack be seen? And what could the American side, having seen it, do about it? The claim the film will make in the parts that follow is a narrow one, and worth stating at the front so that it can be measured against the evidence as the evidence is presented. The claim is that the specific ingredient that made Pearl Harbor, the total, uninterrupted surprise, the arrival of an enemy force at the harbour mouth with no American eye or instrument aware of its existence, cannot be reproduced. Not because the American military is invincible, not because missile defence is perfect, not because human error has been abolished, but because the 2 categories of failure that produced the surprise of 1941 have both been addressed, deliberately and at enormous expense, by 2 distinct categories of response. The first category is technical. It is the architecture of persistent surveillance and instant warning that now watches the world's oceans and airspace on behalf of the United States. The classified imaging satellites of the National Reconnaissance Office, whose orbits and resolutions remain secret but whose existence and persistence are matters of public record. This space-based infrared system, SBIRS, which watches the entire globe for the thermal signature of any missile or rocket launch, and reports what it sees in seconds, not minutes. The layered network of Aegis-equipped surface combatants whose radars and interceptor missiles have now been proven, under actual combat conditions and against actual ballistic missiles, in the skies of the Middle East as recently as April of 2024. The ocean is no longer a wall. The horizon is no longer the edge of American vision. A carrier task force crossing the North Pacific in radio silence, in 2024, is not crossing an empty room. It is crossing a room in which every square metre is being watched, continuously from above. The second category is institutional. It is the great slow answer to the phone call at Fort Shafter, the structure of joint command, unified intelligence, and cross-service liaison that the National Security Act of 1947 began to build, and that 75 subsequent years of reform, reorganisation, and, it must be said, painful additional failure have refined into a working system. There is now no Army radar station whose report to a Navy commander must be routed through a switchboard and a lieutenant's guess. There are joint centres, 24 hours a day, in which Army and Navy and Air Force and Marine Corps and Space Force and civilian intelligence officers sit in the same room, watching the same screens, using the same terminology, escalating along the same procedures. It is not a perfect system. It has failed, in specific ways, in specific crises, in the decades since. But it is a system that exists, and that is designed, at its foundation, to prevent the exact silence between services that killed the men on the Arizona. Those are the 2 categories, persistent seeing and unified telling. And the parts of this film that follow will examine each of them in turn. First the technical architecture from orbit to hull, and then the institutional architecture, from the Joint Chiefs down to the watch officer at a fusion centre, and ask what each of them would have done to the Kido Butai's approach if the calendar on the wall read 2024 instead of 1941. The examination will be honest about what it does not know. It will name the classified capabilities that must be described in general terms because their particulars are not public. It will retain the honest sealing that the American government itself has published. The plain statement of the 2022 Missile Defense Review that the Homeland's missile defenses are neither intended nor capable of defeating a full-scale attack from a peer nuclear power. The counterfactual will be conducted inside a well-lit room, with the limits of the argument marked in tape on the floor. But before that examination begins, one more thing has to be said. The men who died on this morning did not die because their country was foolish. They died because their country was, in a specific and technical sense, unfinished. The tools of their own defence existed. The doctrine that would have wired those tools together did not. What their deaths bought, along with everything else they bought, was that doctrine. The long, expensive, imperfect construction of a defence architecture designed to make sure that no American commander, ever again, would have to sit in a nearly empty room on a Sunday morning and guess whether the biggest blip he had ever seen was worth waking someone about. Whether that construction has succeeded is the question this film now turns to examine. The starting point is the ocean itself, the same North Pacific that Chuichi Nagumo's fleet crossed in radio silence for 11 days without being seen. The same grey water and grey sky and empty horizon, and the question of whether that emptiness is still available to be crossed. The answer, in the plain vocabulary of the people whose job it is to know, is no. The emptiness is no longer available. There is, in the phrase used inside the reconnaissance community, no dark water. To understand what that phrase means, it helps to begin with a small correction to the mental picture most people carry. The ocean, from the deck of a ship, still looks the way it looked to the lookouts on Akagi in November of 1941, a plate of moving grey, curved at the edges, closing on the horizon at a distance of roughly 12 miles. From the deck, the world ends where it always ended. But the deck is no longer the highest vantage point available. It has not been the highest vantage point available since the late 1950s, and the distance between what a lookout can see and what a satellite can see has, in the decades since, opened into a chasm so wide that the two vocabularies barely describe the same planet. The organisation responsible, on the American side, for the widest of those vantage points is the National Reconnaissance Office. It was established in 1961, its very existence classified for the first 3 decades of its operation, its budget hidden inside other line items, its headquarters unmarked. Even now, with the fact of its existence public and its logo, a globe wrapped in an orbital track, reproduced on unclassified documents, the specific capabilities of its satellites remain among the most closely guarded secrets in the American government. What is publicly acknowledged is that the office designs, builds, launches and operates the imaging and signals, reconnaissance satellites used by the entire American intelligence community. What is publicly acknowledged is that those satellites include electro-optical systems, cameras in the ordinary sense of the word, though cameras of extraordinary resolution, and radar imaging systems capable of seeing through cloud and darkness, and signals intelligence systems capable of listening to radio emissions from orbit. What is publicly acknowledged is that this constellation, in aggregate, provides what the community calls persistent surveillance of areas of interest. What the specific resolutions are, what the specific revisit rates are, what the specific coverage patterns are, those numbers are classified, and they will not appear in this film because they are not public, and because inventing them would violate the discipline this examination has committed to. But the general capability is not classified. The general capability is stated openly in unclassified strategy documents, and in the public testimony of senior officials. The general capability is that a naval formation the size of the Kido Butai, 6 fleet carriers, 2 fast battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 8 tankers and supply ships, roughly 30 hulls in all, arranged in a screen several miles across, is not an object that can hide from modern overhead surveillance for 11 days in open ocean. It is not an object that can hide from modern overhead surveillance for 1 day in open ocean. It is, in the language of the analysts, a very large signature. Consider what a signature is. A ship, sitting on the sea, displaces water. The displacement creates a wake, a V of turbulence trailing behind the hull, sometimes visible for miles in the right light, sometimes visible only to instruments that can measure the subtle temperature difference between churned water and undisturbed water. A ship running its engines generates heat that radiates into the air above the stacks, in a plume that is nearly invisible to the human eye, but glaringly obvious to an infrared sensor tuned to the right wavelengths. A ship moving at speed reflects radar energy, a great steel volume of hull and superstructure that shows up on a radar imaging satellite pass as a bright geometric point in the middle of the diffuse return of the sea. A carrier group of 30 hulls does not produce one such signature. It produces 30 of them, arrayed in a formation whose geometry itself, the screen of destroyers around the high-value units, the tanker train trailing behind, is a visual signature at the fleet level, recognizable even to an analyst who cannot resolve the individual ships within it. It is, from orbit, one of the most distinctive objects a human civilization can put on the surface of the sea, and it does not stop producing that signature at night. It does not stop producing it in bad weather. Optical satellites cannot see through heavy cloud, but synthetic aperture radar satellites can. Optical satellites cannot see at night, but infrared satellites can, because the heat from a warship's stacks does not care whether the sun is up. The gaps between what each individual sensor can detect are, in the design of the modern reconnaissance architecture, deliberately covered by the strengths of the other sensors. Where the camera fails, the radar sees. Where the radar fails, the infrared sees. Where a single satellite passes out of range, the next one in a different orbit comes into range behind it. The constellation, taken as a whole, is designed on the principle that the target has no time of day and no kind of weather in which it is invisible. Chuichi Nagumo's advantage in November of 1941 was that he was moving through a volume of the Earth's atmosphere and ocean surface that no one was watching. There were no American patrol aircraft assigned to the Northern Pacific route. There were no listening posts pointed at his frequencies because he was not transmitting on any frequencies. There were no reconnaissance flights overhead because the aircraft capable of such flights, at such ranges, did not yet exist in useful numbers. His fleet was, for 11 days, in a dark room, and he had confirmed the darkness of the room before he entered it. The route was chosen precisely because it was empty of American commercial shipping, empty of American naval patrols, empty of the accidental witnesses who might otherwise have looked up from a merchantman's rail and seen the tops of his carriers against the horizon. The emptiness was the operation. Without it, the operation was not possible. That emptiness is what has been eliminated. The Northern Pacific in 2024 is not empty. It is, from the perspective of overhead surveillance, one of the most heavily monitored bodies of water on the planet, watched not only by American systems, but by Allied systems in Japan and South Korea and Australia and Canada, and by commercial systems whose imagery is available for purchase to anyone with a credit card. A carrier group leaving a Kuril Islands anchorage in 2024 would be catalogued in the American intelligence system before it had cleared the anchorage. Its departure would be noted in a daily intelligence summary that lands on the desks of watch officers at fusion centres across the Indo-Pacific theatre within hours. Its course, its speed, its formation, and its rough composition would be updated as fresh imagery came in. Every few hours, if the target were flagged as high priority, which a 30-ship strike group departing a Russian anchorage most certainly would be. The 11-day crossing would not be a period of American blindness. It would be a period of 11 days of continuous American attention. This is the meaning of no dark water. Not that every square inch of ocean is being stared at, every second of every day, at the highest possible resolution. That is not the claim, and it is not true. The claim, the more modest and more accurate claim, is that any object of military significance moving in open ocean will be seen within a very short interval of its movement, hours not days, and once seen will be watched. The reconnaissance architecture is not designed to detect every fishing boat. It is designed to detect and hold the objects that matter, and a carrier strike group is precisely the kind of object that matters. It is, in fact, the archetypal target the system was built to see. There is a further point to make, and it is a point that would have been unrecognizable to the commanders of 1941. It concerns the relationship between imaging and tracking. In the era of the reconnaissance aircraft, a target detected on one flight was not necessarily the same target detected on the next flight. The pilot took his photographs, returned to base, developed the film, marked the position on a chart, and passed it to intelligence analysts who tried to reconstruct the target's movements by triangulating separate sightings that might be hours or days apart. The workflow was slow, the correlation was uncertain, and the target could easily slip between the gaps. In the era of persistent overhead surveillance, the workflow is inverted. The target is not detected once and then rediscovered. The target is detected once and then held, assigned a track number, monitored across successive passes by multiple sensors, its motion integrated into a continuous plot that is updated automatically and shared in near real time across the classified networks that link the intelligence community. The Kido Butai, in the modern system, would not be a series of sightings requiring correlation. It would be a track. It would have a name in the database. It would appear on the fusion center screens as a small icon moving slowly southeast across a digital map of the Pacific, with a data readout beside it listing its estimated course, speed and composition, and a history of its previous positions extending back to the moment it cleared the anchorage. That icon would be visible not to one watch officer in one room, but to hundreds of watch officers in dozens of rooms across multiple commands. It would be visible to the Indo-Pacific Command Intelligence Directorate at Camp Smith in Hawaii, on the same island Nagumo attacked in 1941. It would be visible to the Pacific Fleet's own intelligence center. It would be visible to the National Maritime Intelligence Center at Suitland. It would be visible, in appropriately compartmented forms, at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, at the Defense Intelligence Agency, at the Office of Naval Intelligence, at the intelligence sections of every deployed carrier strike group and every subordinate task force in the theatre. The single point of failure, the one lieutenant in the one nearly empty room on the one Sunday morning, does not exist in this architecture. It has been engineered out. This is where the second category, the institutional one, begins to intersect with the first, because the technical fact of persistent surveillance would be worth very little if the information it produced was still trapped inside the stovepipes that trapped the ward's radio message and the Opana Point radar contact. 100 satellites watching the Kido Butai would not have saved the Arizona if the picture they built had ended at 7:15 on a Sunday morning on the desk of one untrained pursuit officer with no one to call. The architecture of seeing and the architecture of telling have to be built together, or neither of them functions. The architecture of telling, as it now exists, is the product of a specific and traceable lineage of legislation and reform, and its origin document is the report of the Joint Congressional Committee that investigated the Pearl Harbor attack. That committee, conducting its hearings across 1945 and 1946, produced a majority report whose central finding was almost startling in its bluntness. The disaster at Pearl Harbor, the committee concluded, had not been primarily a failure of intelligence collection. The relevant information had been collected. It had not been primarily a failure of technology. The radar had worked. The failure had been a failure of coordination, of what the committee, in a phrase that would echo through the rest of American defense policy in the 20th century, described as completely ineffective liaison between the Army and the Navy. The two services, charged jointly with the defense of Oahu, had operated as if they were two separate governments occupying the same island. Their intelligence functions were separate. Their command chains were separate. Their communications were separate. Their radar plotting rooms were separate. Their patrol schedules were separate. Their assumptions about who was watching what were separate. And the gap between the two of them was wide enough that a Japanese submarine could be sunk in the harbour entrance. By a Navy destroyer at 6:40 a.m., a Japanese air formation could be detected on Army radar at 7:02 a.m., and the two facts could arrive at the same commander's desk only after the bombs had begun to fall. The National Security Act of 1947 was Congress's answer to that finding. It was, in the specific sense, a piece of institutional plumbing, a law that rewired the connections between the various components of the American defense establishment. It created the Office of the Secretary of Defense, consolidating the previously independent Departments of War and the Navy under a single civilian head. It created the Joint Chiefs of Staff, giving the uniformed services a common table at which to make joint decisions. It created the Central Intelligence Agency, giving the government a civilian intelligence organization that reported directly to the President and whose products were not the property of any one service. It created the National Security Council, giving the President a formal forum in which to integrate the advice of his military and diplomatic and intelligence advisors. It created, in short, the institutional apparatus by which the inter-service silence that killed the men on the Arizona would be replaced by an inter-service conversation that was continuous, structured, and formal. The Act of 1947 was only the beginning. It was, in the judgment of most of the historians and defense analysts who have examined it since, an imperfect and in some respects a compromised piece of legislation. It left too much power in the individual service secretaries. It left the Joint Chiefs of Staff with insufficient authority to compel joint action. It left the intelligence community fragmented in ways that produced further failures in later decades. But the direction it set, toward integration, toward joint command, toward unified intelligence, was the direction subsequent reform continued to push. The Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 passed after another series of inter-service failures whose costs were paid in the debris of a failed hostage rescue in the Iranian desert and the friendly fire deaths in the invasion of Grenada, strengthened the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, empowered the combatant commanders, and made joint duty a prerequisite for senior promotion. The intelligence reforms that followed the attacks of September 11, 2001, created the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the National Counter-Terrorism Center, addressing a fresh set of coordination failures whose lineage traced back, in the analysis of the 9/11 Commission itself, to the same disease of institutional silence that the 1946 committee had diagnosed at Pearl Harbor. The pattern is consistent. A failure of inter-service or interagency communication produces a disaster. The disaster produces an investigation. The investigation produces a reform. The reform tightens the bolts of the joint architecture. And the architecture, imperfect but progressively tighter, is what stands between the American public and the next attempt at strategic surprise. That architecture in the Indo-Pacific theater in 2024 has a specific shape and a specific name. It is called United States Indo-Pacific Command, headquartered at Camp Smith on Oahu, on the same island, within a few miles of the same harbour, where the failures of 1941 played themselves out. It is a unified combatant command in the sense established by Goldwater-Nichols. Its commander, a 4-star officer who might come from any of the services, exercises operational control over all American military forces in the theatre, regardless of which service those forces belong to. The command's intelligence directorate is a joint organisation, staffed by officers from every service and by civilian analysts from the national intelligence agencies. Its operations centre runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and its watch floor is a single room in which Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force and Coast Guard personnel sit within sight of one another, watching the same screens and speaking on the same circuits. The specific plotting problem that killed the men on the Arizona, a Navy contact and an Army contact arriving on separate desks at separate headquarters and never being correlated, cannot occur in this architecture because the desks are the same desk. The correlation is not something that has to happen after the reports are filed. The correlation is the environment in which the reports are filed, and this is only the theatre command. Above it, at the level of the Joint Force, sits the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon, another 24-hour operations floor, another joint watch, another set of screens integrating intelligence from every service and every agency. Above the National Military Command Center, in a strictly institutional sense, sits the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Council apparatus at the White House, both of them staffed by career officers and civilians whose entire professional formation has been shaped by the doctrine of joint operations. At every level, the architecture has been designed to answer a single question. If the biggest blip that anyone has ever seen appears on a radar screen somewhere in the Pacific, whose desk does it land on, and does that desk know whom to call? The answer, at every level, is the same. It lands on many desks. All of those desks know whom to call. The calls are already in progress before the question is asked. To describe this in the abstract is to risk making it sound bloodless, a matter of organisation charts and command relationships, and the dry vocabulary of institutional design. It is worth stopping for a moment to make the contrast concrete. Return, one more time, to the pursuit officer's chair at Fort Shafter on the morning of December 7th, 1941. Lieutenant Tyler is alone in his room, or nearly alone. The switchboard operator is somewhere behind him, and beyond her the building is nearly empty of the personnel who would ordinarily staff it on a weekday. His radar training amounts to a handful of hours. His briefing about the state of American-Japanese relations amounts to the newspaper he has read that week, and whatever gossip has circulated in the officer's mess. He does not know that the Navy has sunk a submarine at the harbour entrance an hour earlier, because the Navy does not tell him things. He does not know that decrypted Japanese diplomatic traffic in Washington has raised the anxieties of the senior officers there to a very high pitch, because Washington does not tell him things either, and the senior officers on Oahu who have some idea of the intelligence picture do not consider it his business. He is a lieutenant. He's on a temporary rotation. He is answering a phone. Now imagine the same call in the modern architecture landing on the watch floor of the Indo-Pacific Command Operations Center. The caller is not one enlisted radar operator at one remote station. The caller may not be a caller at all. The contact may already have appeared automatically on the plot correlated with a satellite track that has been running for days. If it is a caller, the caller reaches a watch officer who is not alone in a room, but is one of dozens of officers on the floor backed by the intelligence director at one flight down and the theatre commander himself reachable in minutes. The watch officer does not have to guess whether the contact is a scheduled American flight, because the schedule of every American flight in the theatre is displayed on the same integrated air picture that shows the contact. The watch officer does not have to guess whether there has been any other suspicious activity that morning, because the reports from every ship and every submarine and every ground station and every Allied liaison in the theatre are visible on the same fusion display. The watch officer does not have to decide alone whether to escalate, because the escalation procedures are written down, rehearsed, and automatic. The blip that Lieutenant Tyler dismissed in under a minute would, in this architecture, be the subject of a coordinated response within seconds, involving not one man's judgment, but the aggregated judgment of an entire integrated command. That is the institutional difference. It is not that the modern American officer is smarter or braver or better trained than Lieutenant Tyler, although he or she is, on average, more thoroughly trained, and specifically trained for the role. It is that the modern American officer is not alone in the way Tyler was alone. The architecture around the officer is designed on the specific principle that no single point of failure can be permitted to exist. Redundancy is not a happy accident of the system. Redundancy is the system. Which brings the examination to the third element, the one that ties the seeing and the telling together into a single tactical picture. It is not enough to say that there are many eyes and that the eyes talk to one another. What has to be described next is the specific way in which those eyes are linked, the actual technical fabric that carries a radar contact from the antenna, that detects it to every screen that needs to see it, and that turns a scattered set of individual sightings into a single, coherent, shared representation of what is happening in the sky and on the sea. That fabric has a name, and it has a history, and it is the reason that the biggest blip that anyone has ever seen would, in the year 2024, appear not on one screen in one room, but on 1,000 linked screens in 100 rooms, correlated in real time with everything else that every other sensor in the theatre was seeing at the same moment. The fabric begins, in the American case, at the level of continental air defense, with the joint American-Canadian command that has watched the skies of North America since the height of the Cold War. Its scope has since expanded far beyond the northern approaches for which it was originally designed, and the way it now reaches out over the ocean, and the way it now speaks to the ships that sail there, is the next thread this examination has to follow. Follow that thread far enough, and it leads to a specific and testable claim about the modern Pacific, that a fleet of the size and composition of the 1941 Kido Butai could not, today, cross the Northern Ocean without being seen. Not for 11 days, not for 6 days, not for one. To understand why, it is worth reconstructing the crossing in the reverse direction, beginning not with the moment the aircraft launched from the pitching decks a little more than 200 miles north of Oahu, but with the moment, weeks earlier, when the ships first began to gather in the mist of Itokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. That gathering, in the autumn of 1941, was one of the great unseen movements in military history. 6 carriers, 2 battleships, cruisers, destroyers, tankers, supply vessels, more than 30 hulls in total, collected in a remote anchorage at the northern edge of the Japanese Empire, in a place chosen precisely for its distance from prying eyes. No American reconnaissance aircraft flew over Itokapu Bay. No American observer walked its shores. No American cryptanalyst read the operational orders that assembled the force. The bay filled with warships, and the American command did not know it. Consider now the same anchorage, in the modern era, on any morning of any month. The bay lies beneath the orbital tracks of a constellation of imaging satellites operated by the National Reconnaissance Office. the American organization whose very existence was for decades a state secret, and whose imaging systems are still among the most closely guarded technologies in the American arsenal. Those satellites do not glance at the Kurils occasionally. They cross the region on predictable repeating orbits day after day, week after week, and the imagery they collect is examined by analysts whose specific job is to notice change. A single warship shifting from its usual berth is noticed. 2 warships shifting on the same day are noticed and correlated. 6 carriers arriving in a bay that does not normally hold 6 carriers is not merely noticed. It is flagged, catalogued, reported, and briefed up the chain within hours of the first satellite pass that reveals the anomaly. In 1941, the Kido Butai's assembly was invisible. In the modern era, the assembly itself would be the first warning, a warning delivered days before the first ship weighed anchor, in the form of imagery clear enough to count the hulls, identify the classes, and estimate the readiness of each vessel. That is only the first layer. Overhead imagery is what the reconnaissance office does most visibly, but it is not all that the American intelligence architecture does. Signals intelligence, the interception of electronic emissions, the tracking of radar transmissions, the monitoring of communications activity, provides a parallel and equally sensitive layer. A fleet of 30 warships, even one attempting radio silence, radiates. Its navigation radars, if used, radiate. Its fire control radars, if tested, radiate. The electronic signature of a fleet at anchor is not the same as the electronic signature of an empty bay, and the difference is measurable from orbit. In 1941, the Japanese fleet's radio silence was near total, and the Americans had no way to distinguish silence with fleet from silence without fleet. Today, silence itself is a signal. The sudden hush of an entire anchorage where routine emissions normally hum is, in its own way, a form of announcement. Assume then that the fleet forms. Assume it weighs anchor and steams out of Hitokapu Bay into the open northern Pacific. In 1941, this was the moment the Kido Butai vanished, not because it was cloaked, but because the ocean north of the shipping lanes was, at that latitude and at that season, functionally empty. No merchant vessels reported it. No patrol aircraft overflew it. No radar station reached it. The fleet steamed for 11 days across 3,700 miles of grey water, and the American command tracked its passage not at all. In the modern era, the ocean is no longer empty in the sense that matters. It is empty of ships in most places most of the time, but it is not empty of observation. The orbital tracks of imaging satellites do not stop at the coastline. They carry the same cameras and the same radar imaging systems over the open sea. A fleet of 30 hulls generates a signature that persists in every band a satellite can record. In the visible spectrum on a clear day, the ships are simply visible. The human eye of an analyst looking at a downloaded frame sees them as grey shapes on darker water. In the infrared, the heat of 30 ships' engines and stacks and boiler rooms rises off the ocean surface as a distinct thermal contrast, visible through cloud that would defeat an optical camera. In the radar spectrum, synthetic aperture imaging systems illuminate the sea with their own signal and read back the reflection. Steel hulls return that signal in a way that water does not, and the distinctive geometry of a formation, the spacing of the carriers, the screen of destroyers, the trailing tankers, appears in the returned image as a pattern that no natural phenomenon can produce. Cloud does not stop it. Night does not stop it. Weather does not stop it. The claim is not that every square mile of ocean is under continuous watch at every second. That is not the way the system works, and the honest description of the system does not require the claim. The claim is that a fleet the size of the Kido Butai, moving on any plausible track toward Hawaii, would pass beneath enough satellite orbits, in enough spectra over enough days, that the probability of it remaining unobserved for the duration of the crossing is, in operational terms, indistinguishable from zero. Add the Allied layer. The northern Pacific is not an American sea alone. Japanese maritime patrol aircraft descended, by an irony that is not lost on any student of the region, from the same military tradition that once launched the Kido Butai, fly the same waters that once concealed it. South Korean, Australian, and Canadian intelligence services share information with their American counterpart on a routine, automatic basis. Commercial satellite imagery, once the exclusive province of national governments, is now sold by companies whose business model depends on identifying and cataloguing exactly the kinds of anomalies a departing carrier group would produce. A journalist with a subscription can, on a given morning, examine a satellite photograph of a foreign naval base and count the ships. A hedge fund analyst can watch the movement of tankers to anticipate a swing in crude prices. The observation of ocean traffic is no longer a secret function of a secret agency. It is a distributed, commercialized, redundant activity performed by governments, corporations, universities, and private analysts, all of them producing data streams that flow, one way or another, into the picture that the American command holds of the world's oceans. Add the sea surface layer, long-range surface radar coverage extending from Alaska and the Aleutians, from the American west coast, and from Hawaii itself reaches hundreds of miles into the approach corridor a modern Kido Butai would have to traverse. Airborne early warning aircraft launched from carriers and from land bases extend that coverage further still. Submarines, American attack submarines, whose presence and patrol patterns are among the most closely guarded secrets of the modern Navy, patrol the approaches to Hawaii and the Western Pacific. Any one of these systems, taken alone, might be evaded by a sufficiently clever adversary on a sufficiently lucky day. Taken together, integrated through the joint architecture that the National Security Act and its successors constructed, they represent an observational net whose gaps are, by design, smaller than the object it is meant to catch. Reconstruct, then, the modern timeline as a documentary chronology, with each entry corresponding to a moment at which the fleet's presence would be established, catalogued, and reported. Day -14, or thereabouts, satellite imagery of Hitakapu Bay reveals the unusual concentration of hulls. An analyst notes the anomaly. The report is filed, distributed, and briefed. The concentration is, at this point, of interest but not yet of alarm. Naval exercises, port visits, and routine maintenance can all produce similar imagery. What matters is that the fleet has been noticed, and that further imagery will now be collected specifically to determine what it is doing. Day -7, or thereabouts. Additional imagery confirms that the fleet includes carriers, that the carriers have embarked aircraft, and that supply vessels are alongside. The signature of a force preparing for a long transit rather than a local exercise. The analytic assessment moves from curiosity to concern. Communications intercepts, if any, are compared against the imagery. Allied intelligence services are queried. The theatre command is informed. Day 0, the fleet weighs anchor and steams out of the bay. This departure is itself detected, by the same satellites, by signals intelligence, by Allied maritime patrol. From this moment, the fleet is a tracked contact. Every subsequent satellite pass adds to the track. Every subsequent intercept refines the picture. The fleet is no longer a curiosity in an anchorage. It is a formation at sea, on a heading, at a speed. Day 1 through day 6, the crossing. Each day, satellite passes update the fleet's position. Each day, the projected track is extrapolated forward. Each day, the possibilities for where the fleet is going narrow. A fleet steaming east-southeast across the northern Pacific has, from a certain point onward, only so many plausible destinations, and the closer it approaches those destinations, the more precisely its intent can be inferred from its course. By the time such a fleet had covered half the distance the historical Kido Butai covered, perhaps by day 3 or day 4, the theatre command would have not only a track but a working hypothesis. This fleet, on this heading, at this speed, appears to be aimed at the Hawaiian Islands. That hypothesis, alone, changes everything downstream. In 1941, the American command in Hawaii was not on a war footing at 7:55 in the morning because it had no reason to be. No warning had reached it. No hypothesis had been formed. The fleet in the harbour was tied up to buoys and moored in nests, its magazines partly locked, its anti-aircraft ammunition partly stowed, its aircraft parked wing to wing on airfields. In the modern era, a track lasting 6 days would not permit that condition to persist. Ships would put to sea, aircraft would disperse, anti-aircraft crews would man their stations, fighters would fly combat air patrol. The Aegis destroyers in the harbour and along the approaches would light off their SPY radars and begin their own long-range surveillance, feeding their data into the same joint picture. The garrison would not be surprised because surprise itself would have become impossible. The attack, if it came, would come against a defence that had been alerted, positioned, and posture set for the better part of a week. That is the meaning of persistent surveillance, translated from technical description into operational consequence. It does not merely see the fleet, it gives the defender time, and time, in warfare, is the resource that determines almost everything else. Now, grant the counterfactual its most generous possible assumption. Grant that, by some combination of weather, evasion, deception, and luck that no serious analyst would credit, but that the thought experiment permits, the fleet has arrived. Grant that it stands, at a moment corresponding to just before 6 on a Sunday morning 230 miles north of Oahu, its aircraft warming on the flight decks. Grant that the American command, against all the previously described improbability, does not know it is there. What happens next? Here the analysis moves from the question of detection to the question of engagement, from what the fleet is to what the defender can do about it. And here the argument shifts to a different technology, one whose capabilities are not inferred from satellite imagery or from the geometry of orbital tracks, but which have been demonstrated publicly and unmistakably in combat. The Aegis combat system takes its name from the shield of the Greek gods, a piece of naming that would, in most military programs, be dismissed as marketing. In the case of Aegis, the name has, over 4 decades of development and deployment, come to describe something like the actual function of the system. It is a shield, an integrated, computer-controlled radar and missile suite installed on cruisers and destroyers throughout the American fleet, capable of tracking hundreds of contacts simultaneously, prioritizing them by threat, and directing intercept weapons against them in a way no human crew could accomplish by manual means. The spy radar at its heart is a phased array system that does not rotate, but electronically steers its beam in microseconds, painting the sky in a way that ordinary rotating radars cannot match. The data from the radar flows into a combat information center, whose displays show every contact in the surrounding volume of air and sea correlated with identification data drawn from friendly transponders, from intelligence databases, and from the integrated picture provided by every other sensor in the theater. Compare that arrangement with the anti-aircraft defense of Pearl Harbor in 1941. The battleships along Battleship Row carried 5-inch guns and quad 40mm mounts, and water-cooled 50-caliber machine guns, and the crews who manned those weapons on the morning of the attack fought them with a courage that has never been in question. But the guns themselves were controlled, in the main, by human operators looking through optical sights, tracking aircraft that were often travelling faster than the traverse rate of the mounts could follow. The radar that existed on Oahu that morning existed at Opana Point, on a mountaintop tied to a single telephone line that ran to a switchboard in a nearly empty office. There was no integration, there was no automation, there was no shared picture. There was Private Lockard reading numbers off an oscilloscope and reciting them into a receiver, and there was Lieutenant Tyler across the island saying, "Well, don't worry about it." The Aegis system is what has replaced that arrangement, and the difference is not incremental. When the spare radar detects an incoming contact, the system generates a track solution automatically. The track is displayed, classified, and, if the contact is assessed as hostile, assigned an intercept weapon. The intercept weapons themselves cover a range of altitudes and threat types. Against aircraft, the system can employ variants of the standard missile family that reach out dozens of miles from the ship. Against short-range ballistic missiles, other variants of the same family provide upper-atmosphere intercept. Against longer-range ballistic threats, the SM-3 series reaches into the exo-atmosphere and destroys incoming warheads by direct impact, hitting a bullet with a bullet, in the phrase that has attached itself to that particular class of engagement. None of this, taken as a list of capabilities, would be persuasive on its own. Weapons programs are famously prone to advertising performance in briefing slides that combat does not confirm. What lifts Aegis out of the category of advertised capability and into the category of demonstrated performance is the specific record of the system in actual combat. In April 2024, in the waters off the Middle East, American destroyers equipped with Aegis engaged live ballistic missiles fired by the Iranian military as part of a large strike aimed at Israeli territory. The engagement was not a test. It was not conducted on a range against a cooperative target. It was combat against real weapons in real time under the operational stresses that no test can fully replicate. And the intercept succeeded. The specific numbers and the specific details of which missiles were engaged by which ships have been discussed in the public record with the caution that such matters demand. What is not in dispute, and what is on the record from the United States government and from allied governments, is that Aegis-equipped ships intercepted Iranian ballistic missiles in actual combat, and that the intercepts worked. That single fact, the April 2024 engagement, is what separates the modern Pearl Harbor counterfactual from a merely theoretical discussion of missile defense. The question of whether Aegis would work is no longer, in the strictest sense, an open question. It has been answered, in the specific way that combat answers questions, by the survival of the target and the destruction of the incoming weapon. A defender that possesses a combat-proven layered defense is a defender in a different tactical universe from one that possesses only paper capabilities, and the American Pacific Fleet in the modern era possesses Aegis in numbers, installed on destroyers and cruisers whose home ports include Pearl Harbor itself, and whose patrol patterns cover the approaches to Hawaii on a routine basis. The honor ceiling on this claim has to be acknowledged, and it will be acknowledged more fully in due course. The 2022 Missile Defense Review, produced by the American government itself, states plainly that the Homeland Missile Defense Architecture is neither intended nor capable of defeating a full-scale attack by a peer nuclear power. Aegis is not a magic dome. Against the massed, sophisticated, penetration-aided arsenal of a Russia or a China, it would be overwhelmed, and the American government has said so in writing. That caveat matters, and it will not be elided. But the caveat concerns a scenario very different from the one under examination here. The Kido Butai of 1941 launched 350 aircraft in 2 waves, delivering torpedoes and bombs from carrier decks. A modern equivalent of that strike, whether pursued by carrier aircraft, by ship-launched cruise missiles, or by ship-launched ballistic missiles, falls within the class of threats that Aegis was designed to defeat, and that Aegis has, in the April 2024 engagement, demonstrated it can defeat. Add to that the third technological layer, the one that operates not on the sea but above it, the constellation known as the Space-Based Infrared System, or SBIRS. The system's name describes its function with the flatness of military nomenclature. Satellites in orbit carry infrared sensors that watch the surface of the Earth for the specific thermal signature of a rocket motor in flight. A ballistic missile launch generates a plume of exhaust whose infrared brightness stands out against the background of the Earth's surface like a flashbulb in a dark room, and the SBIRS sensors are designed specifically to see that flash the moment it appears. Detection occurs within seconds of ignition. The data feeds automatically into the American Missile Warning Architecture, where it is correlated with tracks from other sensors, projected forward to estimate the impact point, and routed to the commands responsible for defending against it. Notification of a launch reaches the relevant watch floors, including the North American Aerospace Defense Command, the United States Strategic Command, and the theater commands whose regions are threatened. Before the missile has finished its boost phase, consider what this means for the counterfactual. If a modern adversary attempted an analogous surprise against Pearl Harbor, and chose, as any modern adversary almost certainly would, to substitute missiles for carrier aircraft, the initial event of the attack would not be the appearance of dive bombers over Battleship Row. It would be the ignition of missile motors on ship decks or on land, hundreds or thousands of miles away. And that ignition would light up on SBIRS within seconds, not minutes, not tens of minutes, seconds, and would flow into the warning network before the missiles had even reached apogee. Walk the timeline forward from that first detection. Second 0, motor ignition. Second 1, SBIRS sensor registers the plume. Second 5, automated processing confirms the detection and begins the track solution. Second 10, the alert reaches the missile warning watch centers. Second 30, the projected trajectory has been refined enough to identify the general area of impact. Minute 1, the alert has propagated to the theater command, to the ships and installations in the projected impact area, and to the Aegis-equipped destroyers whose SPY radars are already sweeping the sky for the incoming re-entry vehicle. Minute 2, the ships have begun their own tracking of the missile as it climbs into their radar horizon. Minute 3, the intercept geometry is being computed, and standard missile interceptors are being prepared for launch. Minute 5 or thereabouts, depending on the range and trajectory, the interceptor engages the incoming warhead in the terminal phase of its flight. Set that timeline against the timeline of December 7, 1941. The USS Ward fired on the midget submarine at 6:40 in the morning. The Opana radar detected the incoming aircraft at 7:02. Lieutenant Tyler dismissed the report at 7:15. The first bombs fell at 7:55. The interval between the first warning and the first impact was, depending on how the warnings are counted, somewhere between 40 minutes and 75 minutes. In none of those minutes did the American defense mount any coordinated response. The warnings existed, the time existed, the response did not. The modern response cycle is measured in minutes, and the modern warnings do not depend on a single lieutenant answering a single phone. They propagate through the network automatically. They arrive at the ships and the watch floors without requiring any human being to make the correct judgment call, and they trigger defensive actions that have been rehearsed until the crews perform them, quite literally, in their sleep. The failure mode that killed 2,400 Americans on the morning of December 7th, the failure of a warning to reach the people who could act on it in time to act on it, is the specific failure mode that the modern architecture has been designed at every level and by every reform to prevent. Which leaves, as the last question in this stage of the examination, the question of what would actually happen in the sky and on the water if a modern equivalent of the Kido Butai's strike was somehow launched against Pearl Harbor today. That question, the question of the engagement itself, of the geometry and duration and outcome of a battle that begins with the launch of an obsolete attack against a defense specifically hardened over 8 decades to prevent exactly such an attack from succeeding, is the question the examination has to take up next. Begin then with the assumption that everything preceding the strike has somehow gone wrong for the defense. Assume, against the weight of every argument already laid out, that the 6-day detection window was somehow squandered. Assume that the imagery from the Kuril Bay was misread, that the tracks across the northern Pacific were lost in some improbable convergence of weather and human error, that the shared watch floors of the unified command missed the correlations their software was built to force upon them. Assume, in short, the scenario most favourable to the attacker, a modern Kido Butai that has somehow reached a launch position north of Oahu, with its carriers intact and its aircraft fueled and armed, ready to repeat, plane for plane and bomb for bomb, the strike that unfolded on the morning of December 7th, 1941. What follows from that assumption is a thought experiment, and it must be labelled as one. Real combat resists the neatness of paper analysis. Weapons fail, systems degrade, crews make mistakes on both sides. The confident tone of a scripted scenario is not the same thing as the ragged texture of an actual engagement, and any honest examination has to concede at the outset that what would happen in such a battle cannot be known, only reasoned toward. With that caveat sitting where it belongs, at the front of the analysis rather than buried at the back, the reasoning can proceed. The first thing the attacking fleet would encounter, long before it reached a position from which its aircraft could be launched against Oahu, would not be defensive aircraft or radar warnings or shore batteries. It would be water. Specifically, it would be the water beneath its own hulls and the submarines that patrol it. The approaches to Hawaii are not empty ocean in the way the Northern Pacific was empty in November of 1941. The United States Navy's Pacific Submarine Force, based at Pearl Harbor itself, operates continuously in the waters around the Hawaiian chain and along the sea lanes leading to and from it. The attack submarines of that force, nuclear-powered, quiet, armed with heavyweight torpedoes and with anti-ship cruise missiles capable of striking surface targets from over the horizon, represent a layer of defense that has no analogue in the 1941 picture. Nagumo's carriers crossed a Pacific in which the American submarine force was thinly deployed, obsolete in doctrine, and utterly unprepared for the possibility that a Japanese battle fleet might be moving beneath the horizon toward Oahu. A modern Kido Butai would be moving through waters in which American attack submarines have, for decades, treated the interception of surface combatants as a central mission, and in which the intelligence machinery already discussed would have cued those submarines to specific tracks days before the fleet came within striking range of anything. A submarine engagement against a carrier strike group is not a certainty. Submarines can miss. Their weapons can be defeated by escort screens, by helicopter-borne sonars, by the counter-detection efforts of surface ships whose entire reason for existing is to protect the carriers at their centre. But the possibility of a clean, unmolested approach, of a fleet crossing the last 1,000 miles of ocean to Hawaii without ever being brought into a torpedo engagement or a cruise missile exchange, belongs to a different era. It belongs in fact precisely to the era of Nagumo, in which submarines were still largely surface vessels that submerged only tactically, whose ranges were limited, and whose detection tools were primitive. The modern picture is different in kind, not degree, and any reasoning about a modern attack has to begin with the acknowledgement that the fleet would be shooting and being shot at long before its aircraft were ever within launch range of their target. Suppose that the fleet survives that submarine phase, that it takes losses perhaps, but continues to advance. What it encounters next is the reach of surface-launched anti-ship weapons. The United States Navy's own destroyers and cruisers, dispersed across the approaches to Hawaii under any credible threat posture, carry anti-ship cruise missiles whose ranges extend well beyond the launch range of a carrier's air wing. A modern surface engagement between a defending force with warning and an attacking force pressing toward launch range is not decided by the moment the aircraft leave the deck. It is decided by which side can identify, target, and engage the other first, and the modern engagement geometry favours the defender whose sensor picture has been built up over days, rather than the attacker whose approach has been continuously tracked. Add to that the reach of shore-based and air-launched anti-ship weapons, the presence of maritime patrol aircraft, the potential for engagement by long-range bombers flying from bases as distant as the continental United States, and the arithmetic of the approach becomes forbidding. The attacking carriers, in this scenario, would be under threat from beyond their own reach long before they reached the position from which the historical Kido Butai launched. Suppose, once more against the odds, that the attacking fleet has absorbed those exchanges and has reached a launch position. Its aircraft leave the decks, they form up over the water, they begin the run south toward Oahu. What they now face is the Aegis envelope, and the Aegis envelope is not an abstraction. It is a demonstrated capability. In April of 2024, in the skies over the Middle East, Aegis-equipped destroyers of the United States Navy engaged and destroyed Iranian ballistic missiles in actual combat conditions, not tests, not exercises, but real weapons launched with real intent against real targets. That engagement was the first confirmed combat use of the Aegis ballistic missile defense system against enemy ballistic missiles, and it succeeded. The lessons of that night are not directly transferable to a carrier airstrike. Ballistic missiles and attack aircraft are different threats, and require different engagement solutions, but the underlying architecture is the same. The Aegis combat system exists to detect, track and engage air-breathing and ballistic threats in the airspace around the ships it protects, and its record against air-breathing threats, against aircraft, against cruise missiles, is longer and deeper than its record against ballistic weapons. The system has been improved through generations of iteration since it first entered service in the 1980s. It has been tested against increasingly complex targets. It has been proved in the specific and narrow sense that matters most, under fire. A wave of 183 attack aircraft, of the kinds that flew from the decks of Akagi and Kaga and Soryu in 1941, would enter that envelope as the softest possible targets. They would be slow, they would be non-stealthy, they would be flying in formations that maximize detection by modern radars. Their weapons, gravity bombs, air-launched torpedoes, would require them to press to close range against ships whose defensive weapons reached dozens of miles outward. The standard missiles carried aboard the Aegis destroyers and cruisers of the Pacific Fleet would engage them at ranges that exceed the historical strike aircraft's own weapons ranges by orders of magnitude. The shorter-range point defense systems, the evolved Sea Sparrow, the rolling airframe missile, the Phalanx close-in weapon system, would form successive inner rings, each with its own engagement envelope, each capable of tracking and engaging multiple targets simultaneously through automated fire control. Above the ships, the fighters of the carrier air wing would themselves be engaging the incoming aircraft, guided by the airborne early warning platforms that would have been vectoring toward the threat since the first satellite Q days earlier. Against that layered defense, the 1941 strike package would not be a threat in the modern sense of the word. It would be a target set. Its aircraft would be detected at ranges beyond their own detection capability, tracked from the moment they cleared their launch decks, engaged in successive phases as they closed the distance, and, in all likelihood, destroyed in numbers that would render the attack strategically incoherent, long before any of its weapons could be released against ships or installations at Pearl Harbor. To say this is not to belittle the courage of the aviators who flew the historical strike, whose skill and discipline were formidable, and whose achievement, on the terms of their own era, was real. It is only to say that those terms, the terms of unguided bombs and slow biplanes, of visual navigation and voice radio, of a defence that had no radar picture and no warning it could act on, have been rendered obsolete by 80 years of accumulated technological and institutional development. A strike that succeeded because nothing in the defensive architecture of 1941 could see it coming would fail today for the equal and opposite reason, because everything in the defensive architecture of the modern Pacific Fleet is designed, in the most literal sense, to see exactly this coming. How short and how one-sided that engagement would actually be, whether the fleet would be broken at sea before launch, or whether the aircraft would reach the airspace over Oahu only to be shot down in the approach, or whether some fraction of them would penetrate to release weapons that would then be intercepted in flight, is beyond confident prediction. Actual battles rarely conform to the tidy geometries of pre-combat analysis. The point of the exercise is not to script an outcome. The point is to notice that the mechanism which made the historical Pearl Harbor attack possible, the achievement of complete tactical surprise against a defense that possessed neither warning nor a means to act on warning, has been foreclosed by the accumulated architecture of the intervening decades. What replaces it in any modern engagement is a contest measured in seconds and minutes, rather than the 2 unimpeded hours the historical Japanese aviators enjoyed over Oahu. The Kido Butai's advantage in 1941 was time. The modern defender's advantage is that same time, redistributed backward into the days and hours before the attack could ever begin. The examination has to be honest, though, about the limits of what it is arguing. The argument is not that the United States is invulnerable. The argument is not that modern defense technology has eliminated the possibility of military catastrophe striking American soil. The argument is much narrower than that, and its narrowness has to be stated plainly, because the temptation to overreach is real, and the historical record is not kind to the confident predictions of invulnerability that have periodically accompanied the arrival of new defensive technologies. The Maginot Line was, in its own moment, a rational response to a real problem. Battleship rows in shallow harbours, in the years before December 1941, were considered defensible in ways that the morning of December 7th proved they were not. Every generation's defensive architecture looks impregnable until the specific attack that will defeat it is designed, and no honest examination of the modern picture can pretend that some future attack, of a form not yet imagined, will not one day expose gaps that today's analysts cannot see. The United States government has itself been explicit about the limits of what modern American defense can accomplish. The 2022 Missile Defense Review, produced by the Department of Defense as an official policy document, states in plain language that American homeland missile defense is neither intended nor capable of defeating a full-scale ballistic missile attack from a peer nuclear power. That is not a statement made by critics of the defense establishment. That is a statement made by the defense establishment itself in an official strategic document describing the limits of its own capabilities against the specific threat of a large-scale nuclear attack by Russia or China. The Homeland Missile Defense System, in its current form and in the forms projected for the near future, is sized and postured to defend against smaller, less sophisticated arsenals. The arsenal of North Korea, most immediately, and against limited or accidental launches from other sources. It is not, and does not claim to be, a shield against the full weight of the strategic arsenals of the world's other nuclear powers. Deterrence against those arsenals rests on other foundations, on the survivability of the American nuclear deterrent, on the doctrines of mutual vulnerability that have governed the nuclear peace for more than half a century, on diplomacy and arms control, and the accumulated habits of restraint that have kept the strategic weapons in their silos and submarines. It does not rest on any claim that those weapons could be intercepted in flight if they were ever launched in numbers. That honour ceiling matters. It matters because the argument being made in this examination is not about invulnerability. It is not about the American military's ability to defeat any conceivable attack from any conceivable adversary. It is about a specific mechanism, and only that mechanism. The mechanism of strategic surprise achieved through the undetected approach of a carrier strike force across the Pacific Ocean to launch aircraft against ships lying at anchor in Pearl Harbor. That mechanism, and the failure of Army-Navy liaison that made it succeed, are what the entire architecture of modern American surveillance and integrated command was built in explicit response to prevent. The National Security Act of 1947 was written in the shadow of Lieutenant Tyler's phone call. The unified combatant commands that emerged from Goldwater-Nichols in 1986 were shaped by the memory of December 7th. The intelligence reforms of the post-9/11 years were designed to eliminate the kind of stovepipes and non-communications that had allowed both the Pearl Harbor attack and the September 11 attacks to succeed. Each of those reforms was aimed at the specific problem of warnings that fail to reach the people who can act on them, and each of those reforms was paid for, in the moral currency that governs such things, by the failures that preceded them. To argue that a modern Pearl Harbor is nearly impossible is not to argue that no future disaster is possible. It is to argue that the specific disaster of December 7, 1941, in the specific form it took, undetected fleet, missed warnings, uncoordinated response, unimpeded attack, has been foreclosed by 8 decades of institutional and technological work directed at exactly that scenario. Other disasters remain possible: cyber attacks, terrorist strikes, ballistic exchanges with peer arsenals that would overwhelm defences no one has ever claimed could defeat them. Attacks of forms not yet conceived. The morning after some future catastrophe, the analysts will assemble to describe how the defence failed, and their descriptions will describe failures that today's architecture did not anticipate. The proper humility about that future is not incompatible with the proper confidence about the past. The past mechanism, the one that killed 2,400 Americans on the morning of December 7th, is the one that has been closed, which returns the examination at its end to the morning it began with, to the water at Pearl Harbor before dawn on the 7th of December, 1941, to the USS Ward turning through the swell at the harbor entrance, and the young lieutenant on her bridge giving the order that fired the first American shots of a war he did not yet know had begun, to the dispatch sent to the 14th Naval District, and the hours it did not have to be considered, and the men at the other end of the line for whom the message became one report among many on a Sunday morning that ought to have been quiet, to the 2 privates on the ridge at Apana, watching a return signal so massive they first believed the equipment had failed, and the phone call to Fort Shafter, and the voice at the other end of that phone call telling them not to worry, to Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, 28 years old, on his second day in a role for which he had received no meaningful training, making the judgment that any reasonable person in his position on that morning might have made, and being wrong. To the aircraft that came in from the north at low altitude and struck Battleship Row before the men on the decks had finished their breakfasts. To the Oklahoma rolling over. To the Arizona's forward magazine erupting in a fireball that killed more than 1,000 men in a single instant. To the harbour filling with smoke and burning fuel, and the small boats going out into that harbour to pull sailors from the water, and the wounded arriving at the hospitals faster than the hospitals could receive them. To the sound, over the radio broadcasts of that Sunday afternoon, of an announcer reading the first fragmentary reports, and the millions of American families gathered around their sets in living rooms where the war had not yet arrived but was arriving even as they listened. 2,403 Americans died before 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning. 19 ships were sunk or damaged. 328 aircraft were destroyed or damaged, most of them on the ground, most of them destroyed before they could take off, because the warnings that would have gotten them into the air had not arrived at the men who could have ordered them into the air in time to matter. That is what the failure of Army-Navy liaison cost, in the specific and irreducible currency of lives. That is what the absence of persistent satellite surveillance meant in the same currency, when persistent satellite surveillance did not yet exist, and no one had yet imagined that it might. That is what the absence of an Aegis combat system, of a space-based infrared system, of a unified Indo-Pacific command, of a joint watch floor with contact correlation software running on hundreds of screens. That is what all of those absences meant. On the morning when they were absent, and when the attack that they would have prevented came in over the water and did the work it had been designed to do. The reforms that followed did not bring back the dead. Nothing brings back the dead. The reforms were not consolation. They were, at best, the institutional form of a promise that what had been learned would be applied, that the specific failure would not be permitted to recur, that the men who had died in the harbour and on the battleships would be honoured in the practical sense that honour can take among the living by the construction of a system in which their deaths would not be repeated in the same way. The National Security Act of 1947 was that promise, made in law. The unified command structure was that promise, made in organisation. The satellites and the sensors and the missile defence systems were that promise, made in engineering. Each of them was purchased at the price paid on the morning of December 7th, and each of them exists because that price was paid. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler was exonerated. That is the finding that eventually emerged from the investigations, and it deserves to be stated cleanly in the same voice with which the failures have been stated. He was cleared. The investigators concluded that he had done what any officer in his situation could reasonably have been expected to do. Given what he had been told, given the training he had received, given the information available to him at the moment the call came in. The failure was not his. The failure was the system's. The failure of a system that had placed a young officer in a chair he had barely been shown how to occupy, that had not given him access to the submarine report from the ward, that had not connected the Army radar network to the Navy air defense structure in any way that would have allowed the information from Opana to reach the men who could have acted on it. Tyler was not the man who lost Pearl Harbor. Tyler was the man in the chair when a system that had already failed, before he ever sat down in that chair, produced the outcome that its failures had made inevitable. His exoneration was the historical record's acknowledgement that individuals cannot be blamed for the failures of the institutions that placed them in impossible positions. The system was rebuilt so that it would not place another young lieutenant in that impossible position. That is the final measure of what December 7th, 1941 meant. It meant that a country which had received one warning too few and had understood one warning too late would spend the following 80 years building the architecture of a defense in which warnings would propagate automatically and without dependence on the correct judgment of any single human being at any single moment. It meant that the failure of communication, which the Joint Congressional Investigation identified as a root cause, would become the specific target of legislation, of organizational reform, of technological investment, of doctrine and training, and the accumulated learning of generations of officers who studied the morning of December 7th as the central case study of what the profession of arms must not be permitted to do again. Whether the resulting architecture is perfect, it is not. Whether it will hold against every future threat is not. Whether some morning in a future not yet imagined will produce its own catastrophe, exposing gaps that today's designers have not anticipated, cannot be known and should not be pretended. The proper posture toward the future is humility, but the proper posture toward the past is honesty, and honesty requires the recognition that the specific mechanism which produced December 7th, the undetected fleet, the missed warnings, the uncoordinated response, the 2 unimpeded hours over a harbour whose defenders never received the warning they had been given, belongs to a world that has, in that specific respect, been ended. It was ended deliberately at enormous cost over 8 decades of work, by the country that had been surprised on the morning it was surprised. It was ended because a nation which had been asked, at the price of 2,400 lives, what such a surprise cost, and had answered by building an architecture in which no such surprise, in that specific form, could be delivered again. The battleships are still in the harbour. Some of them, at least. The Arizona lies where she fell beneath a white memorial that arches over her hull, oil still rising in slow drops from her fuel bunkers to the surface. More than 80 years after the morning her magazine erupted, her name is read at ceremonies. The names of her dead are read. The wreath is laid on the water above her, and the water carries it, and the water carries also the drops of oil that have been rising from her for longer than most of the mourners have been alive. The satellites pass overhead in their orbits, taking their images of ports and airfields and fleet anchorages half a world away. The destroyers stand their watch at sea, their radars turning, their crews rehearsing engagements against threats that have not yet materialized, and against threats that, in the specific shape of December 7th, will not materialize again. And somewhere in an archive, in a folder among many folders, is the phone log from Fort Shafter's Information Center on the morning of December 7th, 1941, in which a young lieutenant, on his second day, told 2 privates on a ridge in Oahu not to worry about the largest blip they had ever seen. He was wrong. The system that had told him he could be right was wrong, and the country that learned, that morning, what such a wrongness could cost, spent the rest of the century making certain that particular wrongness would not, in that particular form, be permitted to cost so much again. The oil is still rising, the names are still read, the watch is still standing, and the morning of December 7th, 1941, remains where it has always been, behind us, in the record, in the memory, in the architecture that was built because of it, so that it would not have to be lived through, in the same form, ever again.